So I guess most recently the book I worked on was Do Glaciers Listen? This was the title. And it goes back, again, these things all seem to go right back to the beginning of working with women and the stories that they were telling. And a number of women told stories about glaciers, glaciers that advanced and crossed rivers and caused floods, how you should behave around glaciers, a whole range of things. And these really were a bit troubling to me because I had no idea why they would be talking about this. None of them lived anywhere near glaciers. And so just to go back a little bit earlier, when I went to the Scott Polar in 1979-80 for that MPhil program, I had to write a thesis, and I thought, aha, this would be a good topic. It was a circumpolar northern thing, places full of scientists. So I thought this would be interesting to talk with scientists about glaciers and other kinds of local knowledge that come into these stories. And that was quite interesting. So I did a thesis called Legend and Landscape, which got into some of the early literature about traditional knowledge, which absolutely exploded later. There wasn't much of that kind of discussion at that point, except in Africa. There was quite a bit of African work that was relevant. But then it continued to, but it didn't take me very long, I should say, by then, because by the mid-70s I knew a lot more about why women were talking about glaciers. And the main reason was that when the Alaska Highway was built, just to step back a bit, the Alaska Highway was constructed very rapidly in 1943, 44, 45 because of the U.S. concern that there might be an invasion from Alaska. They arrived with masses of Canadian civilians, U.S. military, and a large number of people. And of course, it had a major impact on local people. One of the impacts was that in the north part of that highway, north of Haines Junction and up toward the Alaska border, people had always been living in the area that is now St. Elias Mountains. So they were indeed very familiar with glaciers, and because there are a lot of glaciated areas in that region. But after the highway was built, it was deemed that the soldiers had, on their days off, been hunting too much, and that there was the wildlife had been, if not decimated, at least was in some danger. So there could be no hunting there, including by indigenous hunters, for whom these have been hunting territories for generations, for millennia. And so you had this ridiculous situation where somebody who killed a moose on the east side of the Alaska Highway was a good provider, and somebody who killed a moose on the left side of the Alaska Highway went to jail. And that actually did happen, and there were some very serious, troubling cases. So I started, that got me really interested in this whole notion of this book about Do Glaciers Listen? The title that I gave it, because it really was a question that women were asking. This whole area, the St. Elias Mountains, I don't have a map here, but if I did, you would see that the southwestern corner of Canada, where it reaches to Alaska on one side and British Columbia, the southwest corner of the Yukon, is part of the St. Elias ice fields, and that, of course, covers parts of British Columbia and Alaska as well. It's a spectacular landscape, but it's always been sort of treated as though it's far from the rest of the world. It was when Lapérouse went there in 1786, he called it the verge of the world. He said that he had reached the verge of the world, and he found a little inlet on the Alaska coast that he thought was the Northwest Passage. 6 kilometers in, he hit a glacier and realized that he had misguessed. But there's this whole notion of distance and excuse me. Of distance and ancient times is part of a lot of the literature. I got interested in the writings of John Muir, in writings of certainly Lapérouse, who spent quite a bit of time there near where there was a Tlingit community, and also Edward Glave, who I mentioned a bit earlier, who did a lot of work on place names and so on. The framework I worked, though, was a framework I thought of finding for this book, of working about it, was this whole question of how environmental change, there were a number of things that happened. First of all, there's environmental change in that whole area. There's a lot of history on the Little Ice Age and how much colder it was actually, and glaciers were very active at that point in other ways. There's another history of colonial encounters that were happening at the same time, because this was an area where the fur trade was especially deemed to be important. La Perouse was coming from France, but there were certainly British people coming from as well, and Americans, and the fur trade was being established, and this area was impacted. And then there's this whole question of local knowledge in those areas. So I thought those three themes were one way to look at this in some way. Thanks. Yeah, so with this book, I decided that a good way to frame it would be looking at three themes, drawing in each case on the stories that the women had told. But the notion of environmental change, which is significant given what's going on now in the world with melting glaciers. Secondly, colonial encounters, which were many. And thirdly, this whole notion of local knowledge and where it fits in. So I'll just run through some of those briefly, but I think it's really interesting to be able to read the book and hear the actual stories that women were telling in these cases, and also the stories that visitors were telling, because everybody was dazzled by this particular part of the world, or found it very interesting. La Perouse most specifically, I think. The question of environmental change, and at that point, at the point that some of these women were talking about, those stories came from a time in the late 1800s or possibly earlier, but the Little Ice Age was a really significant feature in the circumpolar north in all those areas. So in fact, the glaciers looked different. There were glaciers everywhere, but when La Perouse saw them, for instance, they were much larger than they are now. And now, of course, the environmental issues is climate change. They're melting at a furious rate, and there's a real issue about a whole range of things happening with them as well. Colonial encounters then had to do an awful lot with the fur trade. Really, that would underlay the Spanish, the French, the British, the American entry into this region. And then the notion of, but then more recently, the sanctuary, the park. The park, first of all, there was a it was not a park originally. It was an area that people certainly couldn't hunt. A sanctuary, sorry. It was a colony sanctuary. Then it became a national park, and now it's a World Heritage Site. And during that whole time, until very recently, Aboriginal people who had hunted there for generations were not allowed to hunt in that area. And now there have been, since the land claim settlement, there have actually been extra hearings and extra decisions about the fact that local Aboriginal people can hunt in the park. But they will, of course, point out that the grandparents and great-grandparents who knew where these places were are gone. So they often talk about seeing campsites in there where they know someone must have lived or traveled and camped, and they don't know who it is. So that's a difficult part. And the third question, of course, is this one of local knowledge, which was further delegitimized after the Alaska Highway went through, the idea being that the people who knew were the people who ran the park about how it should be run. And that's changed so dramatically. Now the Kluane National Park, which used to have its headquarters in one area, those headquarters have been changed. They're now on Champagne-Atiak First Nation land. They're right next to the Champagne-Atiak First Nation Cultural Center, and it's a very much a collaborative project, and local knowledge is certainly very much part of what's going on in that park headquarters. And so the land claims process recognizes local knowledge, and I think that's just a big change, even since that book was written, although this is changing, moving all the time, I think, in that general direction. But I think that, again, what I tried to do with that is to tie together the stories of visitors, La Perouse, Edward Glave, John Muir, who all came and all had interactions with people in those communities of different kinds, how they're remembered in the stories from both coast and interior. And just the fact that certainly my puzzle about why would the women be talking about glaciers seems naive. One of the things that was interesting to me was when I first was talking with women about glaciers, when they discovered that I was a hiker and was off in the mountains quite often, they were very, very clear that I should never, ever cook with grease, that is to say, cook bacon in the area. And I puzzled about this for quite a long time, but it was clear that, I mean, I think there are a lot of theories, but certainly glaciers do. The idea in many of the stories is you can't be flippant. You have to be really respectful of nature. Of course, the humans and animals give one another, provides resources for one another, and that's always the case. But it's the case also with trees, and it's the case also with glaciers. You have to be very careful. And many women would talk about, excuse me, these glacial surges happening after somebody did something problematic. One story was that a youngster from the coast, a Tlingit boy from the coast, made fun inappropriately of an inland shaman who was deeply insulted. The youngster said his head looks like a glacier, sort of a knobby thing like a glacier. The shaman went back to where the low glacier comes across. You can see, sorry, I don't have a photograph of this here, but you can see where the glacier comes directly toward a very close mountain, the mountain where it actually reached before the dam burst and there was a flood, something 1850, but probably several times before that. And so just this whole notion of being respectful and being able to recognize these things is really, really important. The colonial, the other thing that's happening with climate change, of course, is that things are melting out of the glaciers. There's a mountain somewhere, it's not in the park, but called Thunblat on Champagne-Asiac territory, where some hunters one day, who were a number of years ago, were up and they discovered suddenly a whole football field size of caribou dung that had been hidden by snow for a very long time. And it turned out that this was a place where caribou used to come to get high up away from mosquitoes and sort of spent long periods of time during the year. And local people had known this all along, but it was a big surprise to the scientists. However, at that point, there were camps that were sort of set up with the kids from the community and some of the scientists working at the Kluane base camp where they were working together and getting some kind of science education for kids and also learning a lot from local people about what really had gone on there. Because in the memory of, say, Mrs. Ned, who I knew, she remembered times in her youth when there were lots more caribou in that particular area. So then the third part about Colonial Encounters, I'm flipping back and forth a bit, but the area of the park had gone from, the sanctuary became then a park, became a World Heritage Site, and then there was the International Boundary Commission that went through that particular area. So the Americans and the Canadians were fighting over this, and the British were right in the middle of this because there was actually the Americans and the British were fighting about which territory belonged to which. So it's become an area became an area that was crisscrossed with boundaries rather than being a place where people lived and inhabited. It's got just a very complex history in that way, I think. But a lot of that is changing very rapidly now. So you asked about some projects since that one, and there are a couple I could point to. One being working with C.McClelland's papers before, when she was in her latter years, she got very interested in trying to get these organized in a way that they could come to the Canadian Museum of Civilization, as it was at one point. Its name's changing quite often. But also that the stories that she had recorded could be documented for communities. So there are volumes, I think I may have mentioned this, that are related to 3 different communities. And I know that people in those communities find them interesting sources, very interesting sources to be able to turn to. One of the projects I worked on recently with people at the Native Language Center is this book called Travels to the Alsac by Edward Glave. Edward Glave was a very interesting character, and again, I talk about him in the book Do Glaciers Listen quite a bit as well. But he was a young man from England born in 1860. Who lived in his mother was a single parent with 5 children, and he decided to try and become an explorer. So he went to Africa. He went to Africa in, what year would it be? He went to Africa in the late 1800s and spent some time there, and then came back. That was one of the few things that a young man with no particular prospects could actually do, is to become an explorer. And he got quite excited by Stanley, and then much less excited by Stanley later on. But he spent some time there, and then after he finished that, he came to North America and was hired by Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, a New York newspaper, to do a trip to Alaska, which turned out to be mostly to the Yukon. But a group of them came to travel. It was an exploration kind of project. But Glave was really quite different from all the others. He got very interested in talking with local people and with recording local names, and he did it really diligently. And so just to finish up his story, he was there for a part of a year. He went back and gave some lectures in New York. He came for another part of a year. But his real dream, it turned out, was to go back to Africa, because he had become convinced, incorrectly, as he later found out, that there was a so-called Arab slave trade ongoing in Africa. And he determined that he would be able to find this if he were to walk across Africa from the east coast all the way to the mouth of the Congo River, which he did. And as he crossed, he discovered that it was not the Arab slave trade, it was the Belgian slave trade that was going on. And he documented every single bit of this. And when he got to the mouth of the river, he took his notes to a missionary and said, if something happens to me, make sure these go to New York. And then he died. He probably malaria, it's uncertain what it was. But he left a huge record of this, and it was the first time that had actually been printed, that what was going on in relation to the Belgian Congo in Africa. Others followed very much. There were other people who had ideas about it, but his record was quite amazing. But so I was interested in him because he must have been in his late 20s when he came to the Yukon, and he did this detailed recording. And with the Native Language Center, we decided a few years ago that what would be useful would be to try to put together a book that documented some of his work. And it turned out to be a massive book. John Ritter, the linguist, is the architect of this. Doug Hitch, he's a linguist as well, but also knows a great deal about travel directions, and was able to plot some of his trips on a map better than I was able to. But also there's a text for this. And it's interesting. I mean, I've got a call the other day from a young woman. I got a call the other day from a young woman who wanted to have a copy of one of the pictures because she knows that it was her grandmother that he sketched. He was an artist as well. And so it's kind of an interesting book because it really does give a sense of the landscape of the country during that time. That was published by the Native Language Center. And then most recently, this really takes me back and makes me realize how long it has been since I was in the Yukon. When I very first came to the Yukon in 1968, I met a young artist named Jim Robb, who is now still living. He's in his 80s now. But he was an artist, and he knew people very well in the communities, and a number of them had passed him, because he was an artist, they passed him photographs and asked if he could duplicate them and give them back, which I'm pretty sure he was able to get them all back. But when I met him, he was interested in trying to do something with these photos. And again, this is 1968. And in the 1970s, when I went back after Alaska, we actually did sit down and put together a book of these, just a very rough narrative to go with all these photographs, many of which go back to before the turn of the century and some of which are in the 30s and 40s. Council, at that point, it was the Yukon Native Brotherhood published it, and the copies were all gone within about 2 weeks because they were quite popular in the Yukon. But about 6 months ago, the Council for Yukon First Nations decided to reprint it and try and make the photos clearer. So we've had a very interesting time being able to do that most recently. We didn't change the text because it's a product of its time, and we added a few little things at the beginning, but so some of those projects are nice to kind of clear up, and now it's more available. But you can see the photographs here of these the people who are now much older than they were when these photos were taken. And these are some from the Klondike that were taken just 1898. But Jim's responsible. Jim is really responsible for this. But I'm very happy to be able to be working with colleagues in the Yukon and sort of doing little projects that probably have some more importance as they get back to families. So that's really about all I can think of to say. I'm continuing. I'm not working on any big projects right now, but I've continued. One of the things that's a great pleasure for me is to be able to read theses and things or papers that young people, Aboriginal people in the Yukon are writing. And quite often people ask me to read something, and I'm always so delighted to see the kind of work that they're doing, because they're going to university and they're doing a whole range of things now that they're very proud of, and I'm very proud to know them. So thanks. That's great.